On Sunday, December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon told her roommate she was going to take a hike. She'd been a little low the past few days and said she thought some fresh air and exercise might help her clear her head and focus on studying later. Sometime after lunch, she left her room in Dewey Hall wearing a red parka, sneakers with thick soles, and clothes suitable for a short walk in the cold. She didn't pack a bag, didn't take extra belongings, and unlike her usual habit, she did not sign out before leaving campus. From the school's point of view, nothing about that plan was unusual. Students went out for walks all the time. Paula was expected to be gone for a few hours at most, and then be back on campus that evening, in time to study and sleep in her own bed. But I'm making a video about this, so obviously she never came back. But before we get deeper into these cases, it will help to actually picture where this is happening, so I want to give like a little context. So all of this sits in the southwest corner of Vermont. Bennington is a small New England town near the borders with New York and Massachusetts, and Bennington College is just north of town on a rural wooded campus. A few miles northeast of Bennington is Glastonbury Mountain, a part of the Green Mountains. It's about 3,700 feet high, heavily forested all the way to the top, and not especially dramatic on a map, but it's surrounded by rough, remote woods that are harder to access than they look. Running over that ridge is the Long Trail, which in this section shares its path with the Appalachian Trail and then heads north along the spine of the Green Mountains. The trail crosses Route 9 east of Bennington and then climbs into what's now the Glastonbury Wilderness, one of the more remote pockets of national forest in the state. Small communities like Woodford and the area called Woodford Hollow/Bickford Hollow sit along that route between town and the mountain, right where a lot of the Paula sightings are placed. On the far side of the ridge to the northeast, you've got Somerset and Somerset Reservoir, a long isolated lake at the headwaters of the Deerfield River, also surrounded by national forest. So hopefully understanding that will help you understand these cases a little bit better. Just some context of where things are in relation to one another should help. Let's move on. Her roommate went to bed that night without seeing her. That by itself didn't trigger a full search. It was possible she was with friends or studying somewhere else on campus. The real alarm started the next morning. On Monday, Paula didn't show up for classes. She wasn't at breakfast, she wasn't seen around campus, and when staff checked her room, her things were still there. Her suitcase hadn't been taken, her belongings looked undisturbed, and there was no note explaining where she had gone. By late morning, it was clear that no one at Bennington had seen Paula since early Sunday afternoon. Around noon on Monday, the college's admissions director, Mary Garrett, contacted state's attorney William Travers Jerome Jr. to report her missing and ask for help. By late morning, it was clear that no one at Bennington College had seen Paula since early Sunday afternoon. On a small women's campus like Bennington, that kind of absence is hard to miss. Roommates, professors, and dorm staff had all quietly checked their own spaces and come up with nothing. She hadn't gone home, she hadn't signed out, and there were no confirmed sightings after she walked out in her red coat. With that, it stopped being something the students could shrug off, and it became a problem for the school itself, setting up the first organized response from the college. Bennington's first move was small and close to home. Administrators and staff organized an immediate search of the campus itself. Dorms, common areas, nearby grounds, just to rule out the obvious possibility that she was just asleep somewhere, hurt, or holed up studying. Once they confirmed she wasn't anywhere on campus, attention shifted to where she might have gone hiking. Paula had talked before about wanting to visit Everett Cave on Mount Anthony, so that became the first concrete lead. That afternoon, a small group from the college went out with local farmer Henry Steele from Fairdale Farms, acting as a guide. They checked the cave area and the surrounding trails, but didn't find any trace of her. No footprints they could tie to her, no clothing, nothing left behind. While the students were out in the woods, other locals started getting looped in. A taxi driver, Abe Ruskin, told police he thought he'd driven a Bennington student to the bus station on Sunday, but he couldn't say for sure if it was Paula, and the clerks at the station didn't remember anyone who matched her description. It had been a pretty busy travel day, but still, that possibility sat in the back of everyone's mind. So either she'd gone into the hills and gotten hurt, or she'd quietly left town on a bus. With no solid proof of either, authorities were stuck in that early gray zone where you can't even be sure which direction to search. And remember, this was the 1940s. By Monday night, they pushed her description out on the radio and into the regional papers. Photos of Paula went out across New England, and the police in New York and Massachusetts were notified. On campus, students and faculty were already shifting from "she'll turn up" to "something is actually wrong." But the first assumptions were still fairly grounded. Maybe she'd gotten lost trying to hike alone before dark, maybe she'd taken off for a day or two and misjudged how worried people would be. But people didn't know where this case was going to go yet. By the way, I'm going to pause right here, guys, to say, number one, if you want this kind of content more, please subscribe or 5-star on Spotify, wherever you are. It would mean a lot. And I want to say I'm not an AI voice. In one of my videos, I asked how I can prove that, and one of you guys, I think a few guys, said to get further from the mic. So I'm gonna do that. I'm getting further from the microphone right now, and I'm coming back. Now I'm gonna twist the microphone around so I sound different. Hopefully you guys believe me that I am not an AI voice now. One person said that I should fart in the mic. So if you guys still don't believe me, I guess I'll have to do that. Anyway, back into this case. Once Paula's face was on front pages and coming through on radio, the sightings started piling up fast, but they didn't all agree with each other. The strongest cluster kept her exactly where everyone assumed she'd gone, on the long trail. Multiple witnesses put an 18-year-old girl in a red jacket moving east out of Bennington that Sunday afternoon. A local contractor, Lewis Knapp, later told reporters he picked up a Bennington College student hitchhiking near campus, dropped her off along Route 9 a few miles west of the long trail, and remembered her saying she was headed there to hike. Around 4 p.m., a man named Ernest Whitman and 3 friends said a young woman matching Paula's description stopped them in Woodford Hollow to ask how far the long trail went and how to get to it. They watched her walk over a bridge that led toward the trail and into the woods just as daylight was fading. Other Woodford residents later said they'd seen a similar looking girl near a shelter known as Faye Fuller Camp that afternoon. Though even at the time there was some confusion because another young woman in the area had a similar build and coloring. And that whole set of accounts is why search teams very heavily focused on Glastonbury Mountain and the Long Trail section above Woodford. At the same time, there were sightings that pushed her off the trail and back into the road network. A local cab driver, Abe Ruskin, told police he'd driven a Bennington student to the bus station on Sunday afternoon. Once he saw Paula's picture, he thought it might have been her, but he couldn't be sure. Station staff also didn't remember anyone who clearly matched the photo, and it was a very busy travel day. So if it was her, she could have taken a bus toward Albany, New York City, Burlington, or Pittsfield, which blows the search radius wide open. On top of that, at least one Woodford resident told reporters they'd seen a dark maroon car with Connecticut plates in the hollow that Sunday with a man and a young woman who looked like Paula inside. That got checked out as a possible lead, but never turned into anything solid. That's one thing about this case that's really interesting but confusing, is that there's just so many leads. So many people think that they know what happened, or they think they have information, which I'm sure happens a lot, but all of these are actually were worth looking into, which is crazy. I feel like the detective team and the investigation must have been so exhausted and tired. Goddamn, bro. So then you've got the sightings that drag the story even hundreds of miles away. Within days of her disappearance, a waitress at the Modern restaurant in Fall River, Massachusetts, reported serving a visibly upset young woman who, in her opinion, looked exactly like the girl in the newspapers. The woman was with a man in his mid-20s who had been drinking and acting rough with her. When he went up to pay, the girl supposedly pulled the waitress over, asked how far it was to Bennington, said she needed to get there, and claimed she'd arrived in Fall River with a large amount of cash that was now gone. Local police took it seriously enough to do a house-to-house check around the restaurant and circulate the man's description, but they never found proof that the woman was actually Paula. Other papers briefly mentioned lookalikes on trains in western Massachusetts or applying for work in Boston, but the details shifted between stories and none of those leads held up under follow-up. By the end of that first week, investigators were stuck juggling 3 competing pictures. Paula as a hiker who vanished somewhere somewhere along the long trail, Paula as a traveler who might have slipped out of town by bus or car, and Paula as a face in a crowd states away. And every one of those versions came from someone who was absolutely sure they'd seen her, and none of them could be confirmed. For the first few days, everyone was working off the same assumption. Paula got into trouble somewhere on the long trail. Search parties from the college, locals, the Vermont State Guard, and even aircraft focused almost entirely on the woods between Route 9, Woodford Hollow, and up toward Glastonbury Mountain. They swept trails, side spurs, and the obvious hazards over and over, marking off areas as they went. And when that still turned up nothing, still not a scrap of clothing, not a single footprint they could tie to her, authorities started to rethink what they were dealing with. By midweek, Bennington College President Lewis Jones put out a statement saying that officials now suspected foul play and believed Paula's body might have been hidden, not just lying somewhere off trail waiting to be found. Around the same time, 3 men who had spent that weekend at a camp near Glastonbury were questioned as possible witnesses or suspects, and the focus started to drift away from lost hiker and more toward crime victim. Which, I mean, just imagine being the family and hearing that. Like, first of all, this your daughter or whatever, goes missing, which is already horrible, but then for 3 days you think they're, gonna find her, and then 3 days later, the investigators, like the authorities, tell you that, yeah, actually, we think that she's dead. Like, that's crazy. But then what's interesting is that the shift of what they think wasn't just about theory, it also affected what they were even allowed to do. Vermont didn't have a state police force in 1946, so the case was technically in the hands of the county sheriff, the state's attorney, and a lone state investigator, Almo Franzoni, which is a cool ass name. And they were quickly overwhelmed. Under pressure from Paula's father, Governor Mortimer Proctor asked Connecticut's governor to send help, and Connecticut state police detectives were brought in to re-interview witnesses and chase leads that went beyond the mountain. Leaning into a foul play theory also bought them time and resources. Treating Paula as a likely crime victim justified keeping outside investigators on the case still, as well as continuing organized searches and pushing for broader cooperation from other states. So in the long run, the way this investigation stalled and splintered with no clear command and no statewide agency or any consistent procedure became one of the main arguments for actually creating the Vermont State Police in 1947, with Paula's disappearance held up as the example of how badly things could go without it, which is interesting. But now, okay, so if you're trying to understand how Paula could disappear without a trace, you have to look at where she was supposedly going, not just what she was doing, which brings us to the Long Trail problem. The Long Trail in that area is not a cute little campus loop. So once you get past the road and houses at the edge of Bennington and Woodford Hollow, you're in a rough, heavily forested country fast. The trail climbs toward Glastonbury Mountain through mixed hardwood and conifer forest, with side paths, old logging roads, and unmarked spurs that were even less obvious in the 1940s than they are now. In winter, a lot of what looks like just the woods can hide like steep drop-offs and streams and ledges under snow and leaf litter. So if you step a few feet off the established route, it becomes very easy to lose the line, especially if you're not carrying proper gear or light. Weather is the second problem. Early December in southern Vermont is cold, damp, and unstable. By late afternoon, temperatures drop fast, and any wind on the ridges cuts through light clothing. Paula was wearing a red parka and sneakers, fine for a daytime walk close to town, but really not great if you're stuck out after dark on a higher ground. Hypothermia in conditions like that really doesn't require a blizzard, it just takes a couple of bad hours in wet or cold air with no shelter. And visibility is also a big issue. On December 1st, sunset in that part of Vermont hits in mid-afternoon. Under tree cover, it gets dim even earlier. If Paula reached the Woodford Hollow area around 3:30 to 4, like some witnesses said, she was heading onto the long trail as the light was already dropping. Once the sun is down, the combination of dense woods, uneven ground, and no artificial lighting really turns the trail into a kind of maze. Like one fall off the path or one wrong turn down the wrong road, or a slip into a brook or ravine can put someone out of sight of the main route just within seconds. And that's the problem with the long trail, like what made it so hard, is that when most of the searchers are coming in after the fact, snow and time have already wiped out whatever tracks Paula might have left. And then next in my script, I was gonna go back to the other, like, leads, like the cab driver and the waitress and stuff, but it's basically just all explaining it like all again. So I don't know why, I'm not gonna read all this. I just added more detail. But basically those other things just never went anywhere. Like the cab driver never was sure, and the waitress thing never went anywhere. Paula didn't take any luggage or anything from her place, so it didn't make sense that she would go on a bus to somewhere out of town. One other thing that is worth mentioning, I guess, is that a pretty strange out-of-state moment came almost a year later in South Carolina. Police there picked up a young woman at a tourist camp after the operator thought she looked exactly like Paula and noticed that she checked in under the name Mary Weldon. Some reporting says she later used Mary Garrett as an alias, which just happens to be the name of Paula's admissions director back at Bennington. She was really close to Paula's age, and she looked very similar, even had like the same scar that Paula had, but in person this whole thing just fell apart. The woman insisted that she was from St. Louis, she didn't have any connection to Vermont, and she had a southern accent that Paula's mother actually immediately flagged as incorrect. So yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna move on to the next section because, yeah, my fault, guys. So basically, for the first couple of weeks, it felt like something had to break. You had college students, locals, the Vermont State Guard, and even planes out over Glastonbury. Connecticut State Police came in to help because Vermont didn't have a police force. Everyone was turning over the same ground. Everything was happening, and still nothing. The reality, I mean, it makes sense. Vermont didn't have unlimited manpower or money or a centralized agency that could just keep this going forever. Search parties can't live on a mountain indefinitely when there's no fresh lead, no new sighting, and winter is setting in. After weeks of effort, the big organized searches were called off. Smaller volunteer efforts kept popping up, but the official push lost momentum once it became clear that they weren't going to find anything new. And the core problem behind all of this was that there was no body, no piece of clothing, no confirmed crime scene, and no hard evidence that she'd left the area by bus or car. Every potential lane, lost hiker, foul play, voluntary disappearance, it stalled out at the same place. You could argue for any of them, but you couldn't prove one over the other. But this is where the case takes a turn. Now, for all my attentive viewers, you've probably noticed that the title of this video is about the Bennington Triangle, not just one case. Up to this point, we've been sitting almost entirely in Paula's disappearance because that's the one with the most detail and the one that really pushed Vermont into the spotlight. But Paula is not the only person who went missing in this same patch of southern Vermont. In the 5 years around her disappearance, a handful of other people, different ages and different circumstances, also vanished in roughly the same region, mostly in late fall, with similarly thin answers. At the time, newspapers did start to point out how many unsolved disappearances were piling up around Glastonbury Mountain, and decades later, that cluster got packaged under a single name, the Bennington Triangle. The first case was Mitty Rivers, a 74-year-old hunting guide who vanished on November 12th, 1945, while leading a group in Bickford Hollow, about 4 miles west of Bennington and just north of Route 9 near Woodford. He knew the area well and he had hunted there for years. Searchers never found his body, only a handkerchief with some money in it, discovered the following spring along a trail south of where he was last seen. Paula Weldon, of course, went missing a year later, on December 1st, 1946, roughly 2 miles south of where Rivers disappeared, again in the Long Trail Glastonbury area. Then, on December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula was last seen, James Tedford, a 68-year-old World War I veteran, disappeared while traveling by bus from St. Albans back to the soldier's home in Bennington. Family saw him board in St. Albans. He was last clearly accounted for at a transfer in Burlington, and after that, the trail gets fuzzy. Some reports have him possibly getting off early near Brandon, but there's no confirmed sighting of him in Bennington and no trace of him afterward. In October 1950, 2 more cases land in the same broad region. On October 12th, 8-year-old Paul Buddy Jepson vanished from a small county dump outside Bennington where his parents were caretakers. His mother left him in their truck while she went to go move pigs, and when she came back about half an hour later, he was gone. Bloodhounds tracked his scent along a nearby road to an intersection and then lost it. Just 16 days later, on October 28th, 53-year-old Frida Langer disappeared while hiking near Somerset Reservoir on the other side of Glastonbury. She slipped into a stream, told her cousin she'd cut back to camp to change clothes, but she never arrived. Her body wasn't found until May 12th, 1951, about 3.5 miles from where she was last seen. The remains were too decomposed to give a clear cause of death. At the time, the locals definitely noticed the pattern. During the Jepson search in 1950, the Bennington Evening Banner ran pieces explicitly calling him the 4th disappearance in 5 years, and speculating about whether the region might be a kind of lost horizon, borrowing that phrase from the novel about people vanishing into a remote mountain landscape. That's the first real "these might be connected" moment in print. Same rough area around Glastonbury, same late night timing, same outcome of someone simply not coming home. The actual label Bennington Triangle, though, comes later. Writer Joseph A. Citro, dude, these fucking names, I never know how to pronounce the names, dude. This is what trips me up. How do you pronounce this? Is it Kitro? I swear, bro, I'm not AI, I just don't know people with these last names. Like, okay, it's Citro, yeah, okay. Anyway, writer Joseph A. Citro popularized the name Bennington Triangle in the 1990s to describe this patch of southwestern Vermont, centered on Glastonbury Mountain and including Bennington, Woodford, Shaftesbury, and Somerset. And he grouped these 5 cases together as one cluster of mysteries rather than separate incidents. So when we talk about other disappearances entering the story, we're really talking about 2 layers. What locals were already noticing in those 5 years from 1945 to 1950, and then the later decision to wrap those incidents up under one shared label and treat them like a single haunted pattern. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some more deeper detail on all of the cases, not just Paula's, because Paula's is the most famous and the most, we have the most details about it. It's the one that's, kind of emblematic and iconic of this Bennington Triangle. But the other ones also are, horrible and terrifying and mysterious and interesting. So let's go into some more detail on those, specifically through the lens of these 3 main explanations that people give to the Bennington Triangle. Starting with the idea that somebody just had an accident. So for straight up accidents, the geography and timing do a lot of the work. Rivers was an older hunter in rough country with changing weather. Even though he knew the general area, more than one write-up points out that Bickford Hollow itself wasn't his regular terrain. So getting turned around, having a medical event, or both is completely plausible. He's basically the textbook experienced outdoorsman who still gets in trouble, and the fact that only a cartridge or handkerchief ever turned up fits with the idea that he went down in dense forest or a ravine and was missed by searchers. Paula has an obvious accident path too. Solo on late afternoon hike in December, light clothing for night temps, and a mountain with side trails, brooks, and steep icy sections. Mainstream coverage from the time and later books treat lost, injured, and exposure as the default theory once the initial search turned up nothing. For Jepson, you've got a young child in a truck by a dump/road, described as developmentally delayed in some sources, last seen alone and then just gone. And that naturally pushes people toward he just wandered off and succumbed to the elements, or he got hit by a vehicle and was removed. And his scent trail reportedly stopping at a nearby road intersection feeds both of these ideas. Langer's case is the most straightforward in this bucket. She slipped, got separated near water, and her remains were later recovered near Somerset Reservoir. Her body was too decomposed for a cause of death, but drowning or a fall in extremely rough terrain is exactly what local writers and later analysts suggest. Tedford is the odd one out on accident in the woods. His likely accident zone is along a bus route or in a town, not on Glastonbury itself. But even there, older man with mental health issues wanders off, collapses, or ends up in water or woods off the road is a mundane possibility that people do fall back on. Then there is the opportunistic harm/foul play angle. Now this one shows up most strongly in Paula and Langer's cases, and to a lesser extent in Rivers and Jepson. With Paula, investigators actually really did lean hard into the idea that someone hurt her once weeks of searching turned up nothing. They pulled in outside detectives, focused on a lumberjack along her route, which was Fred Godet, and revisited him years later because of his inconsistent stories and his own apparent bragging about knowing where she was buried, even though no physical evidence ever backed that up. In modern write-ups, you'll also see speculation about a driver who picked her up either before or after the last confirmed trail sighting and then or killed her elsewhere, disposing of her body far outside the search area. Basically the classic stranger abduction template applied retroactively. Rivers has his own foul play theory, and if you remember, Rivers was the 74-year-old hunting guide. Some authors and commenters suggest that he might have been shot accidentally by another hunter and quietly hidden to avoid charges, which would explain the total lack of remains despite heavy search effort. But that idea is based on inference, not any documented suspect. Jepson Jepson, which is the 8-year-old, his case is where people go the darkest. There's a pretty reasonable fear that a passing driver grabbed him while his mother stepped away. But then there's also the more lurid rumor mill version where his parents were somehow involved and he was like fed to the pigs or something, which shows up in later articles as speculation rather than anything supported in that like original reporting. Langer's story is the one that really keeps the human culprit conversation alive, because Langer's body was reportedly found in a spot that had already been searched at least once in the early effort, and that's led some modern writers to argue that her remains were dumped there later, implying murder and staging rather than a simple wilderness accident. Telford, again, is the least dramatic here. Nothing in the record screams robbery or homicide, but technically he falls into the same category of could have run into the wrong person once he stepped off that bus with all his belongings. And then there's the third theory that gets applied to all of these, which is voluntary disappearance. And this one sits in a middle ground, kind of, because you're not blaming the Woods or a killer, you're saying that that person chose to step out of their life. And Paula, again, with a lot of these, I think just because she's been covered the most, is the one who gets this treatment the most. Contemporary coverage and later summaries list theories that she ran away to start a new life, eloped with a boyfriend nobody knew about, or possibly died by suicide somewhere beyond the search radius. None of those theories ever got support from her room, her finances, or her social circle. Like, there's no missing suitcase or love letters or I can't do this anymore type of notes. But they do keep coming up because they're one of the only ways to explain the total lack of physical trace. Tedford is another candidate people point to. He was described as mentally unwell and unhappy about returning to the soldier's home. And some modern commenters basically treat his vanishing as a likely case of an older, unstable man walking away from his obligations, possibly to self-harm rather than anything paranormal. And then for Jepson, this voluntary thing really just means more like childlike wandering rather than a planned escape. Sources note that he had special needs and had wandered before, which makes the whole he left the truck on his own and something happened after theory much more plausible than a secretly plotted runaway scenario. Rivers and Langer don't have much in their record to suggest deliberate disappearance. Both had deep roots, existing routines, and were out on pretty short practical trips when they went missing. So any idea of, oh, they just walked away to start over is pretty much just pure speculation. Now, once you step out of just these case files and you actually look at what people were saying about the Bennington Triangle, the whole thing kind of gets really weird, but really interesting. So this all goes back to, again, Joseph Citro, the guy who coined the term Bennington Triangle. In a 1992 radio commentary, he kept building this narrative. It started there and then he kept building it through his books. He said himself that he mixed real disappearances with local stories and then added fanciful speculation that even he didn't actually believe. But let's get into some of these details. So first we have an idea of a Bigfoot. The Bigfoot angle centers on what people now call the Bennington monster. Folklore blogs and books repeat an early 1800 story where a stagecoach near Glastonbury Mountain had to stop because the road was washed out. Apparently, the driver supposedly noticed huge non-human footprints in the mud just before a giant hairy creature slammed into the coach and knocked it over. Passengers reported glowing eyes in the dark and an inhuman scream before it ran off. Later, 20th century wild man stories around Bennington and Glastonbury, like an unkempt man in a coat flashing people and waving a pistol before disappearing into the woods, have been retrofitted into proto-Bigfoot lore. Modern write-ups explicitly plug this monster into this cluster of disappearances that we're talking about, especially with the older outdoorsmen, suggesting that the hunters like Mitty Rivers, and another case, Carl Herrick, who died under weird circumstances near the region in 1943. Anyway, that they might have crossed paths with some huge unknown creature. There's obviously no evidence for this beyond just vibes, but you can see why people would think it, especially back then. Then you've got the Cursed Mountain and a native legend layer. A ton of articles say that local tribes supposedly avoided Glastonbury, used it only as a burial ground, and told stories about dangerous spirits there. Some pieces specifically mention Abenaki stories of a man-eating rock that would swallow anyone who stepped on it. Also, I hope I pronounced that right, dude. I don't want to mispronounce a native, name. It's Abenaki, okay. And then when you chase those claims back, though, they almost always run through modern writers, rather than through documented pre-colonial sources, like, again, Citro, and regional ghost story books and online listicles. Skeptical researcher Sharon Hill straight up points out that things like Native Americans said it was cursed are repeated constantly likely, but they really are dubious, quote unquote, in terms of traceable origin. Citro himself told Vermont Public he might have either made up or half remembered the man-eating rock when he wrote about it. So that's kind of fucked up, bro. That's kind of fucked up. And now that man-eating stone is now one of the most quoted bits of Bennington lore. The way Citro describes it in later summaries is basically that nobody alive has seen it, native people supposedly knew about it, and if you're unlucky enough to stand on it, the rock becomes less solid and swallows you whole. From there, it's basically fan theory. Writers ask if the people who vanished from 1945 and 1950 stepped on the hungry stone, using it as like a metaphorical explanation for why there's no remains for these cases. But it's kind of fucked up and crazy that one guy can like put his fan fiction into an actual native tribe's like folklore. That's like weird. Then UFOs and portal talk come in later, once the Bennington Triangle gets lumped into the same category as the Bridgewater Triangle and other so-called window areas. Citro has said he sometimes tossed in alien abduction ideas tongue-in-cheek, and more recent podcasts and paranormal shows have actually run with it. The region around Bennington and Glastonbury has its share of mysterious lights in the sky anecdotes. Local coverage and roundups mention strange glowing objects and odd aerial phenomena over the mountains without much detail. Modern paranormal content then assigns specific disappearances to that narrative. Tedford becomes the guy who vanished between bus stops and therefore a perfect abduction candidate. Jepson is a child who disappears from an open area with a very short window of time, and that slot is easy to fill with a craft instead of a car or a simple wander off. And then it gets even crazier, like some more fringe takes describe Glastonbury as a portal where Bigfoot, lights in the sky, and missing people are all expressions of the same underlying dark entity or something. I don't know, man. On top of all that, there's the general haunted forest vibe. Glastonbury is a failed logging / mining town turned ghost town sitting in a big block of national forest. Articles and podcasts talk about strange lights, untraceable sounds, odd smells, and families claiming their ancestors encountered monstrous or prehistoric looking animals in the area. Other stories of a wild man living in rock caves get blended with Bigfoot ideas. Hikers and hunters describe sections of trail that go weirdly quiet or feel wrong. And that atmosphere gets retrofitted onto all 5 of the 1945 to 1950 cases. In that storytelling space, Rivers and Weldon don't just get lost. They like walk into a place that people were always warned about. And Jepson isn't just a kid who disappeared in a dangerous gap of attention, he's lured by something unseen. Even Langer's body turning up months later in an area said to have been searched becomes proof that the mountain takes and gives back on its own schedule. It's pretty out there, but people really did think this. This was a pretty big theory. It's crazy how many weird theories there are attributed to this kind of stuff, these disappearances. By this point, we've basically got 4 brackets people keep trying to shove these cases into: accident, opportunistic harm, voluntary disappearance, and then all that paranormal stuff. So I'm gonna go through all of these and work through like why none of them really work, for the most part. You'll see. So accidents. Accidents make the most sense on paper, and honestly they probably do at least explain some of what happened here, but the issue is when people try to stretch that to cover like all 5 of these disappearances. For Rivers and Langer, bad luck in bad country actually kind of lines up with what we know from other wilderness disappearances. Search and rescue data in mountainous regions show that even big organized searches miss bodies all the time, especially when you're dealing with steep slopes, thick forest, and cold water. Studies of SAR in North America put initial detection rates lower than most people think. It often takes multiple passes or a change of season before remains are found. So Rivers vanishing without a trace and Langer only being discovered months later by chance is frustrating, but not impossible. Where accident starts to wobble though is when people start to like try to use it as a cluster explanation. Tedford was on a bus route and then probably in town. If he collapsed, fell into water, or died of exposure, you'd expect some paperwork or discovery later. An unidentified body, a set of remains found by hunters, something. There's nothing like that tied to him in Vermont death records or later news coverage. For Paula, the accident theory has the terrain and timing on its side, but decades of hikers and hunters going through Glastonbury, plus the original ground and air searches, have never turned up a scrap of clothing or bone that anyone can tie to her. So if you want all 5 or accidents to be your answer, you have to be okay with a string of statistically unlikely misses in a row, all in roughly the same area over a short window of time. And then next we have the opportunistic harm angle. The foul play angle is tempting because it patches the exact hole that accident theories leave, which is there being being no remains. If someone abducted or killed these people and moved their bodies, of course you're not going to find them on the long trail. The problem is that as soon as you start asking who, where, and with what evidence, everything thins out. With Paula, you at least have named people. The lumberjack, who allegedly made comments about knowing where she was buried, and the various men with cars floating through the story. But there's no physical evidence, no clear timeline that puts her alone with a specific subject, and no later confession that holds up. Modern write-ups that bring up the lumberjack, Fred Gaudet, will eventually all admit that investigators never found enough to charge him. And then with Jepson, the abducted from the roadside idea matches a terrifying pattern that we do see in other cases, but you'd expect rumors about a particular car or someone in town who suddenly turns into the neighborhood boogeyman. The original coverage talks about possibilities, but it doesn't actually point to any actual predator. If you try to extend foul play to Rivers and Tedford, you end up leaning on a lot more speculation than evidence. Another hunter shot Rivers and hid the body is a story that only exists to explain a missing body. Like, that's his only purpose. There's no report of any kind of strange shots or blood or suspect. And then for Tedford, any harm he met would have happened somewhere between bus stops or after he got off near town. Places where bodies, wallets, or at least rumors of a crime usually surface, and no such trail exists. Then the voluntary disappearance angle. Voluntary disappearance gets used as a catch-all whenever someone's life doesn't have an obvious disaster in it. Maybe they ran away is pretty much just how the culture fills in blanks. And for these Bennington cases, it's doing more emotional work than evidential work. Paula is, again, the obvious target for this. Young, at college, under some stress, newspapers at the time and later books float ideas about her eloping with her boyfriend, or a secret boyfriend, like I was talking about earlier. And the problem with this, again, is that there's just no evidence for it. I mean, like all of these. With Tedford, some writers basically split the difference. He didn't plan a glamorous new life, he simply walked away from a place he hated and maybe took his own life. It's not impossible. I mean, he was older, he had mental health issues, and he was unhappy at the soldier's home. But again, there's no body and there's no note. But then once you get to Rivers and Langer, voluntary disappearance stops making sense completely. Both were doing routine practical things, guiding a hunt and walking back to camp to change, and had deep local ties. There's nothing in the record suggesting they wanted to start over or dump their families and communities. And I don't think I need to go over the paranormal ones, because I don't think any of us believe the paranormal ones. And I've already talked about it a lot earlier, so I'm gonna leave that at that. And that's pretty much the end of this, guys. This cluster of cases doesn't have a lot to go off of. I explained about as much as I could. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know if you want more stuff like this. Put some cases down in the comments if there's any case you want me to talk about in particular. I'm not gonna spoil it yet because I actually might not fully do it. I need to look into it first, but I did get a Discord DM asking to do a certain case, so, you know, I really do listen to you guys and what you want. Just let me know, you know? I hope you enjoyed this, guys. This one was fun to make. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for watching, and sweet dreams.